Hello, everyone. My name is G. I'm here today with Brad. We've got an emergency podcast for the Building Foodtech podcast. Last episode, we were talking about the controlled environment agriculture industry and some of the struggles that it was going through. And unfortunately, in this kind of emergency podcast episode, we have a little bit of unfortunate news and time to reflect and look back. Um, Brad, with freight farms, it's something that's really personal to you, something that's been a part of your entrepreneurial journey. I just want to give you the floor and kind of your, just coming from the gut. What are your thoughts? How do you feel? And, what really happened?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just jumping right into it, those that are not aware, Freight Farms filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy as of April 30th, which includes ceasing operations and everything that goes along with that. So, a couple things I want to do is just kind of get it out there and talk about what it is, what it isn't, what I know, what I don't know. And go from there. So, I mean, I will say I'll start with sort of my position in the whole thing, so you know what questions I can answer, what I just don't know. Obviously, I was a founder of Freight Farms, and ran the company until end of 2020. And so since then, I was a board member for a long while. After that, I actually rolled off of the board last year in some of the transactions that were going on in a completely amicable way. Like there was just a lot of moving parts, and my time was not best spent as a kind of passive board member. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a founder. Being a passive board member doesn't really fit by and large. But anyway, so great relationship with the team, with our investors, with the board. you know, and we had a new CEO who came in December with a plan to kind of like reignite growth, get things back on a good track, and everyone agreed. Seemed like a good plan. He's a really he's a good guy. All of those things. I got to know him, and then communication went a little light. I would say about 6 weeks ago, at least, because I would text with everybody, kind of informal, and it went a little light. And then I actually found out about the how bad it was via text from a couple teammates who had just been laid off, basically. People who I had hired 12 years ago or something like that. So I was caught a little unawares in terms of how to respond to all of that. And then I found out about the actual filing the same way the general public did. There was an email. I didn't get that email, but then there was chatter on the internet and people posted it. So I read kind of the same things that everybody else did. So that was how I found out. And so with that, the questions I can answer are, one, like, no, I don't have any real inside information. What was the last few weeks look like? What happened there? Any of those things. I don't know what will come of this, and what's really going on. I do know a little bit about the structure. So it's a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, so it is liquidation and shutdown, not a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which is generally restructure and then bring the company out without the baggage of debt, et cetera, et cetera. This is Chapter 7, so it's a liquidation, not a restructuring. And I know the process began on May 1st, which is file, pass everything over to a court-appointed trustee that evaluates all the assets and everything within the trust, and we'll set a time and auction off said assets. That's what I know. That's really kind of all I know. In terms of the details, I'm sure there'll be more to come as the trustee gets his or her feet under them and goes through all the documentation. And so I would say, the from what I've read, the narrative around it is that, the company was slated to go public via a SPAC in 24. That transaction didn't happen, didn't work out. And then throughout the year, and then obviously in Q1 of this year, the market conditions deteriorated, broadly speaking, but also for vertical farming and controlled environment ag, like we've talked about on this pod and some conversations. And that's really what kind of led to the straw that broke the camel's back. I could pontificate about if the company held on for 6 more months or this, that, the other thing, but I just don't know that to be true. And that's really where it kind of put us, right? Say, put the company and puts me today is, chapter 7, liquidation, move on.
Not to kind of go into like a little bit of therapist mode, but how do you feel, Brad? Like, I know that this was a company that you invested a lot of time and effort. Like you said, you hired on a lot of people that you've known over the years. And, I'm sure that as the end comes for, that portion of their careers, right? I'm sure that you have a lot of thoughts and feelings for that. And so I'd love for you to, feel free to share them.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's definitely an opportunity to learn in all of this. And I did have the distinct pleasure, was it last week, to get together with some of the team that have been laid off and, have a beer and chat, and just be humans with each other outside of the fray of startups and the whole journey that it is. I mean, I think how I'm feeling, I would say I'm still working through it. Definitely disappointed, sad, all those things that come with the fact that the company I founded is no longer, which is still a hard thing to even consider and to say. One of the things that I was able to say to some of the team, and I meant it 100%, they know this. I don't like to give talks generally. I'm not a like, hey, will everybody quiet down because I want to give a speech kind of person. I will speak when need to most of the time, especially with the team and in public settings. But I made my peace with where I stand with freight farms. I would say in this instance, I'm fortunate in that I've had time to create arm's length between myself and freight farms. And an important process for me that I wish happened faster, I wish it wasn't so hard to do, was a few years ago, was disconnecting, I'm not freight farms is not me. Like, because for the longest part of, I can remember, as the company went, I went. As the company's worth went, I went. And that was, it was just lockstep. And so the process for me was really difficult to disconnect my own personal worth from that of freight farms. But I think it was really great to sit with some of the team, that had just been laid off. A bunch of people came out who left the company, a year ago, 2 years ago, completely different circumstances, all around the idea that, the concept of freight farms was more than one thing and one person. Like I got very comfortable with the idea that I'm not freight farms is not me. And I think with any company, like, it's no one person, and it's not it's all the people who contribute and what they put into that concept, that becomes a company, that becomes a movement, that becomes, an organization. And, I've taken a lot of solace and comfort in the fact that, everybody who contributed to this idea, that was it was a wacky idea in a wacky space that didn't exist yet, in a parking lot in Central Mass, 13, 14 years ago when I came up with it, to the level that it got to and went to. I'm just eternally grateful to have been, a major part of moving that forward, but also just like to be able to work with all the people that I got to work with. And, I think one of the things I'd said, and, was like that, no one can ever take away the heart and soul that you put into an effort. And, just the fact that we as a community that being our customers, team, partners, vendors, like the industry that we created, the progress that we made towards something much, much greater than, just freight farms or just a farm in a box or just hardware or just software, any of those things. It actually makes me, proud and very happy. And so, I wasn't sure how I would feel when the news happened. I wasn't sure how I would feel the week after. But talking to the teammates and then just the outpouring of support from the industry at large has, honestly, has made me feel great is not the right adjective, but just so proud of the industry and the community that it is, because there are companies left, right, and center that are coming out saying, hey, like, if you're a Freight Farms customer and you're stuck and you need help with something, we're here. We do something like that. We do something close to that. We do exactly that. All the things on the table, just reach out. That was not something I had considered. Obviously, I didn't really have time to think about all this, but probably one of the things that has been most rewarding, if you could say. The result is a really great community of builders, entrepreneurs, founders, and farmers that, when shit hits the fan, the community steps up.
So, Brad, just reflecting on the time from when you started Freight Farms to when you left, can you just think about the progression of the company throughout that period? Because I think that maybe that can inform where the company is now. And before we actually do a deep introspection into the company and seeing, with the benefit of hindsight, we can analyze and evaluate a lot of things. But perhaps with some of the context, and as a founder, the guts of the story more than anybody else, other than your fellow co-founders and early employees. From kind of having that early prototype, right, of a hardware company into eventually a company having, a biotech component, right, and, biology, biological sciences in their software platform, a cloud-based platform. Like, just, inform the audience a little bit about that initial start and into the progression of the company.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's always fun to revisit the highlights and the story of the company. It is kind of interesting how the evolution or the founding story of a company can change over time, although the facts generally remain the same. At least I hope they would remain the same. That's probably for a different conversation. But Freight Farms was born initially out of a singular paper I wrote in grad school when I was at Clark University in Worcester. That was sparked from some work I had already been doing around hydroponics and aquaponics. I had been growing at a school in Boston when I was there before I went to grad school, and was just fascinated with the whole developing field. I mean, hydroponics and aquaponics is not a developing field. It's been around for thousands of years, but the introduction of technology to it. So yeah, I mean, it really kind of started from a first semester sustainability paper around what would it look like if we had a network solution to food production. What if it was nodes of food production to reduce, greenhouse gas, food miles, et cetera, and that basically was the next 3 years of my grad work, where I was getting my degrees, was, okay, how can I take this kernel of an idea and make it into something that actually might do the thing that paper pointed me towards as a really interesting societal outcome of local food everywhere, networked farms, production close to where people are, in the control of people who are in that community, all those things. And so, yeah, so that was it. Hard charged through 3 years, pissed off a lot of different professors because I was crafting my entire education around what was best for Freight Farms, not generally what they thought was the best path for the curriculum, which they don't always love. And, then focused, my entire thesis around Freight Farms and what that would be. And you know, we did a Kickstarter campaign back when Kickstarter was, well, they weren't doing $10 million product launches at that time. We raised like $20,000 or something, and we thought we were a big deal. And so did the Kickstarter team, because that was a lot of money back in that point, around 2010, 2011. And then lived inside of a container in a parking lot in the wrong side of campus next to the, they call it the transfer station. Some call it the recycling center. It's where all the trash goes. And across the street from a now defunct but phenomenal, terrible, shitty dive bar, the Blarney Stone, which lives in lore in the Worcester community. And just lived inside that container whenever I didn't absolutely have to be anywhere else for the better part of a year and a half, I think. Just growing food, selling it to people in the community to try and make money to buy more parts and run more tests. And then, from there, it was already in. There was no decision to dedicate myself to Freight Farms. I was all in, and then had the pleasure of going through, Mass Challenge in Boston, Techstars in Boston, taking off from there, moved through some of the most, I'll call them interesting office spaces throughout Boston, because we were always exceptionally frugal is the friendly term I'll use. We were cheap. We were not willing to pay for space or amenities or anything nice. All dollars had to go to the farm. And that put us in some great spots for stories. And so ran that play until 2020 when I stepped away, or when I was kind of moved out, I would say. The company at that time I'd only raised like 40 million or so for the company. And we had farms in, I think, 40 some odd states and like 30 some odd countries. As of shutdown, it was all 50 states and I think 45 or so countries, which is really phenomenal. Like that far exceeded where I actually thought the network would go when I was building in that parking lot back in like 2011. So that's phenomenal. I mean, I think on that journey, what I didn't really touch on is where the industry as a whole stood when Freight Farms started. There was no such thing as the term ag tech. It didn't exist. If I used it in customer, investor, or partner meetings, it was generally laughed at, because they were like, okay, you're just trying to make what you're doing or trying to do sound like a thing by putting tech after it. The got to keynote like the indoor ag conference. Like I think the first indoor ag conference that ever convened, we were there. We were representing. We were explaining what was possible. At that time, still explaining to people that you could grow food with LED lights. That's where the science was back then. And I still remember the location because it was 50 or 60 people in a room. So you could say hi and repeatedly bump into all the people who were there in a two-day event. Now you go to any one of the international indoor ag conferences, there's going to be a few thousand people there at the small ones, even more at the big ones, and you don't have a shot at meeting everybody. But got to see the progression, and I hope do a lot of good for the movement from the time that it was, 40 people in a room to, I don't know, 40,000, 400,000 people around the globe, all sort of working in this space.
When you look back at your time at Freight Farms and then examine also, as a board member and then kind of being a proud father watching their kid try to go on their own in a way, right? Where do you think the kind of turn happened where Freight Farms was growing, doing well, and then now hit the stumbling block, and then now on to Chapter 7, solvency?
I mean, it's hard to say because I have been out of the day to day in a tactical form since 21. So that's quite a span to not have full visibility. I would say it's nothing that isn't traditional startup lore, and probably what sounds like, will sound really trite, I suppose. But at a certain point in there, the thing that had always made us great was that we were always willing to innovate and to keep pushing and to do the thing that was very almost counterintuitive, almost contrarian, if you will, is the term, and then go all in on that and build for the user. Like early days, that was me. I was growing. I was just like, hey, I need to grow this stuff. I'm selling at the local store. I need to be able to do it more, better, faster. And so I think that's where the turn really came. And so I don't know exactly where it fell off. It's not like something that there's any one thing and any one decision, I would imagine. But I would say probably in somewhere in 22, 23 period, maybe. Again, not really sure, but once the company was no longer ruthlessly innovating and pushing the envelope, then we lost that edge, and there wasn't that same sort of direction. I would say we were. That was always kind of the North Star, if you will, of like innovate for the customer aggressively, and that rudder kind of fell off, which, going into 21, 22 timeframe, there was a lot of momentum behind the company. We were growing like crazy. The product itself, was getting to the point that we had kind of envisioned it from a consistency, a yield, a usability standpoint. And there was just a phenomenal roadmap and pipeline of additional innovation to come to pass, from just being more efficient, being able to grow more plants, doing a ton of unsexy cost down engineering around the actual farm itself to get the overall cost down. And yeah, at some point those things just weren't happening at the clip that they once were. And I think that's like any company. Once that happens and once that starts to happen, everything else gets harder.
Brad, I know that you talked about how you were really close with a lot of the employees, and I think that when I was there visiting freight farms and getting to know some of the people there, getting to see the work that they were working on, I mean, I was highly impressed with it and thought like things were working really well, at least to someone outside looking in, right? But I think that, it goes to show just how powerful having great employees can be. It just makes everything look better. I think that when we think about company closure, right, as an investor, as a founder, you often think about, oh no, I've lost investor money, or as a founder, like I've done something wrong, right? But there's a lot of people who are relying on you, right, to allow for them to have their livelihood, to create their careers, for them to be able to learn and grow and be better practitioners of their craft, and to move and actually apply their efforts towards a mission, right? And Freight Farms, is a very mission-oriented company. And from, from discussions that I've had with you, and from just a lot of the conversation and the narratives that are around, food tech in general, a lot of it has a lot of that kind of altruistic messaging to it, right? That allows for great mission-driven companies. I think that it's very unfortunate that, the employees, they're unfortunately left in a lurch. A lot of these companies, when they go under, it's not just, investors who are losing money, right? Because ultimately, to a lot of those investors, that money is, at some points, negligible to them, to the employees, it means a lot. So from that perspective and from that context, can you just go a little bit into, what are the concerns for these employees, and how, if anybody who's watching is able to help some of these employees,
Mhm.
how they can probably do so?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think I almost want to put two groups into that bucket because there's the unique element about freight farms, which always has been, was that our customers were such an important part. And obviously, just like of the work we did and the network and all of those things. But if I think about it from a understood risk perspective, you mentioned it. Investors, they know the risk, like not to be glib about, the investors or their money, but, it's a very well discussed idea that you're taking this amount. It's called risk capital. So you're putting money into something for a hopeful return with risk. Employees, there is a certain understood level of risk, especially as like a startup and whatnot. You know, but not as much as investors, by any means. And then there's customers. And in this case, the customers, from Freight Farm's perspective, it'd almost be easier if Freight Farms grew lettuce in a clamshell and sold it to supermarkets. Because then you'd say, all right, no more clamshell lettuce for you, supermarket. And I don't know anybody feels bad for a supermarket, nor should they, but in this case, those customers are themselves oftentimes entrepreneurs, founders of their own farm business, whose livelihood depends on growing food and selling it to people and selling it to their customers in an effective way. So, I kind of want to bucket your question into two categories: the customer bucket and the employee bucket. And on the customer bucket, I have been doing a bunch of outreach to companies in the space. I had a few calls today because there's so many great companies, some that were competitors, some that are tangential, all those other things. I don't have a great answer for like, hey, go here for this, go here for that yet. I'm trying to work through that just because I think it's the right thing to do. And, if I can get together some recommendations for different parts that could be helpful, as in like a control system, a cloud-based system, all those other things, I would say the good news is, like I said, there's such a great community of other companies, some that are fiercely competitive with us. And, at the end of the day, are good people doing good work, so can provide really good support. So not much to say there yet, still working through it. On the employee side or the team side, I mean, I had a couple calls today, again, with other, companies in the space, because the group of humans that we put together, thinking, like looking back now, haven't had much time to do hindsight, but the amount of agency they took over the customer experience, the product, the technology, is just something I'm like, wow, I just pray I can repeat that someday, at Morrissey Market or anywhere else, because I just read a book a couple weeks ago. I forget how it's by now, but it's called The Founder Mentality, and so many of these people gave their knowledge, their time, their emotions, their livelihoods to push something forward. And that's kind of the mission bit of it, sure. But it just seemed like they were of a different breed that just took such intrinsic pride in the work that they were putting out, whether it was like an SOP for like a customer or a new piece of technology. It's the kind of thing you can't pay for, you can't buy it, to a certain extent people have that or they don't. And so, I would say, in terms of those people, there's dozens of them who have come through Freight Farms, and a number of them are, who are there right down to the last day, who I can vouch for. Are the analogy I make is, I don't know, I've never, like, it's like that meme or that movie where they're in a war or something, and you've got the hard scrabbled veteran that's like sitting on the edge of the foxhole smoking a butt while while the new recruits are cowering in the little hole, and the can just say that's not even close. That's take it easy. It's not even close, and then gets close, gets down the foxhole, and says, "Okay, just follow me, and you'll stay alive." And there's a lot of those people who have been through all the good, all the bad of working in an environment that involves plants, that involves hardware, that involves software, that involves an emerging industry that hasn't really defined itself yet, that is a unique set of characteristics and skills. So I'm just trying to put that word out there that those people are phenomenal, and the outcome does not reflect the caliber or the commitment that they had from day one and that they keep to this day.
From an investor's perspective, it's just, I think that especially throughout this year, right, every down cycle, you really get to learn, right, getting hit by a lot of company closures, and it almost becomes a little bit numb and desensitizing in a way to work through them. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that employees are definitely one of the areas where um, I wish that I was better in terms of being able to place people or be in a better position to, make recommendations. So it's really great that you're able to field those calls and have those conversations about how to, quickly onboard those people in other places. I think that, it's one of those things where if you're, one of those, uh, you know, investors with great outcomes, right? And too young to be able to have one of those. I would just say I'd pull a lot of great employees and I just push them into the winners. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I just think that from an investor's perspective, that's probably one of the most powerful things that investors can help provide to companies. Everyone takes their best swing, and we often use the baseball analogy of like singles, doubles, triples, home runs, right, to talk about outcomes, and they're
Yep.
all usually successful, right? But in some cases, it almost feels like a company that's been doing well for a while. Well, the baseball analogy, I guess the best that I can come up with is a foul ball or some form
Mm-hmm.
of tip foul, right? And in that sense, right, it's almost bittersweet in a way because you see it heading for the wall and uh nope, too far in one direction or the other. The analogy actually feels really apt because in the trajectory of a company, you're almost like, ah, I can see the success for it. And then it's straight a little bit far to the right. Doesn't count.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder from your kind of perspective and having the industry knowledge that you have and reflecting on, the time that you've had at freight farms, right? Could it really have been avoided in a way, like, especially with just hindsight right now? What do you feel like could have been done differently?
Um, I mean, the question of like, could it have been avoided? The inevitable answer is almost anything could have been avoided. So not to fully skirt the question, but the answer is yes. Like, could this have been avoided? Could things have been avoided? The What I don't have an answer for is exactly how. I think I touched, the broad elements of, you know, losing a little bit of speed and direction around innovation for a particular cause, that being like the customer, the grower, um, is probably I would say the biggest culprit, you know, that, that happens to any company, and that's what's, I hate to even use it as an answer because it's kind of generic. You could see that for any company, in any space really. Um, you know,
When we look at like innovation being applied as a tool in a company, it's usually when we talk about like nascent capabilities and trying to apply them larger into horizontal market segments, right? That we
Mhm.
have created a niche product that works for one group. We're going to innovate, which allows for us to grow the market base. That's one potential application of innovation, right? Another one is we want to penetrate deeper into a very lucrative market. And
Hmm.
so, whether we're going up market to more valuable customers, we're going to innovate and create from a strong niche foundation, build on top of it and have, a more harder to get innovative product that penetrates
Hmm.
a deeper group. I guess from that kind of line of questioning, we just think about like where Freight Farms was positioned. This innovative track, which direction did it go, and then what other direction potentially could have worked? Because I think when we look at food tech, the
Hmm.
quite prevalent view nowadays is that going the consumer route, right, and trying to compete with legacy farms was just not a good
Hmm.
proposition, right?
Yeah.
And that potentially relying on a narrative about freight farms, which I saw on research, was relying a little bit too much on nonprofit money, right? And that the
Hmm.
market dried up, and thus, proved that maybe going deeper into or expanding into a market space that wasn't as
Hmm.
lucrative
Yeah.
was a major issue. So I guess just kind of looking at it from that lens,
Yeah. No,
I
I mean, it's a
wonder
good,
what your thoughts are.
yeah, no, I mean, it's a great framing for it. And I mean, I think when we were at our best, and I think the strategy that I like most when it comes to bringing like tech to a new space is wherever possible, don't compete. Like you're going to be small, you're going to be underfunded, your tech's not done yet. You can't compete you can't compete in the same game that everybody is playing. And so when we were at our best, we were able to do that. We're essentially rewriting the rules and defining a new game. And to that end, where I think they're where I think things went astray are that we were serving a lot of different customers and didn't continue. Like one path I would argue is that we didn't take that advantage of creating a new game and then playing that game to our absolute best, of being world class in this new game that we had created, which would be this, tech enabled small business farmer, to create a network of farms and leverage all the advantages that come with like not being the first person on the network to grow basil or strawberries or this, but to be the 1000th, and really lean into that. Because that, in a lot of ways, that was the mission. That was what we set out to do. And, at a certain point, things got fragmented and frayed because that's hard and it stays hard. And I think as the industry evolved, it was relatively easy in the beginning because no one was doing it. The idea that a farm was the product was completely asinine when we first started to talk about it. Then it became mainstream, and it was like, oh yeah, you have containerized modular farms. Like, yeah, of course you do that. That's a thing. Um, so I think, you know, the idea of, yes, we're selling to nonprofits, like, it became more of an exercise in, oh, that's a market segment that we could sell to. And the conversations, probably didn't happen aggressively enough, or, with enough intellectual honesty. And I was part of these conversations. Like, I don't, I don't, I don't shirk any blame for some of the missteps, but, you know, um, those conversations weren't had around aggressively enough around like, are we getting away from the game that we created and trying to go play, like you create this thing and then you're like, oh, okay, but now we're going to go over and play baseball with the pros. Like you're not going to, have your first at bat in Major League Baseball when you've been over here playing badminton. Like you're just not going to be good. And, did we allow that? Do we allow that sort of drift or that wander, that lack of focus? Yeah, I could say that probably, happened and then continued. And which generally I would say, like, if you're, the other side of that, another factor, if I'm going to be completely honest, is then we were stuck with, I say stuck with, that sounds bad, but the technology, the hardware, software, the systems was on a development track for one thing, and then it was being sold to another. And each customer segment has a very different economic model, has very different motivations, has all these other things. And, you know, I think it's fine to pursue other segments in that respect, but the product has to keep pace. The product has to adjust and adapt and iterate, to become like the no-brainer choice for that customer and know who that customer is. And like when we were firing on all cylinders, we knew who that customer was. We were rapidly, making small, medium, and large changes to the platform and to the product as fast as we could, specific to impact that customer to make the experience better. And once that went away, it's a hard time.
I appreciate the honesty in your look back at Freight Farms, Brad. And I think, I'd like to leave it off in a little bit of an optimistic look and a little bit of an up note.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it would be great if you look back at your time fondly and your time working with the great team at Freight Farms and the impact that Freight Farms had. I'd love for you to just give your acknowledgments for the team, for the work that's been done, and what kind of the future holds as we close on this episode.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think the tone of optimism. I'm an eternal optimist. You wouldn't do this if you weren't an optimist. But yeah, I think I'll never have anything but fond memories of Freight Farms and the work that we all did. And, again, just want to acknowledge all the people, our earliest customers, our last customers, the team that all put their heart, soul, blood, sweat, livelihoods into trying to further an idea. And, I think everyone involved, will, it's no comfort now, but all of that will push the entire industry forward and is going to benefit people for generations. I honestly believe that. I believe that all of the work that's been done, like the wins, the losses, the learnings, are going to only benefit because this industry as a whole and the work that's being done is too important. It's not something that just goes away and then poof, didn't exist anymore. There's long-lasting impacts for generations of growers as technical growing and indoor growing becomes more and more part of the mainstream food system. So I want to acknowledge that and thank everyone for pushing that forward and contributing to it. And I think also I need to acknowledge, this is kind of a story in flight. Our conversation here is, it's incomplete, and, one of the things that I am going to pursue is a bit of a postmortem. There's a lot of activity. I'm sure, I can't get a lot of communication right now because there's all sorts of activity going on behind the scenes and things like that. But I am going to pursue at least the opportunity to sit with those who made the decisions and whatnot, just to chop it up and find, clear, whatever it is, like clear eyes, full heart, just, have the conversations with no ego, with no blame, just, hey, what could we have done better? Where did we go wrong? What happened? And, honestly, I hope to learn from it. And, on the other side of it, I hope to be able to give some closure to those that, did so much for so many people they'll probably never even meet. And, it's kind of the least I could do is to acknowledge all that work and to acknowledge that, it's worthwhile to find out the most we can, talk about it, and try and learn from it.
Thank you, Brad, for coming on and doing this emergency podcast. Um, I think that it was really important to kind of have this kind of flushing of emotion, a little eulogy for the company that you've given, many years of your life for. A lot of great employees that you've worked with, the hard work that they've done, and also the backers who gave you the opportunity to go
Mhm.
out and do this. Um, I really appreciate everyone for sticking around and watching through this whole pod. Hopefully, you got a lot of value learning from war stories and from a lot of the different inner workings of a business. It's not always pretty. We'll be going back to our regularly scheduled programming, Food as Medicine, on to the next episode. But, Brad, just want to thank you so much for being on. Thank you, the audience, for watching. And until next time, everyone, have a good one.